The coal dust of Manchester did not just settle on the skin, it seemed to seep into the soul, staining it with a permanent hue of gray. It was 1887, and for Elias Thorne, the world had shrunk to the size of a loom, the height of a smokestack, and the endless rhythmic clatter of the industrial machine that devoured men's lives as greedily as it devoured raw cotton. Elias stood outside the iron gates of the textile mill, wiping his grease-stained hands on a rag that was already saturated with oil. The sky above was a bruised purple, heavy with the promise of rain that never seemed to wash the city clean. Around him, the streets were a river of workers, faces hollowed by hunger, eyes fixed on the cobblestones, shoulders bowed under the invisible weight of survival. They were ghosts, Elias thought, haunting their own lives. He clutched the parcel under his arm tighter. Inside was his dinner, a heel of stale bread and a scrap of cheese. But more importantly, inside his coat pocket, heavy against his ribs, was a letter. It was crumpled at the edges from the many times he had read it. The ink faded slightly where his thumb had traced the words. The letter was from his brother, Silas. 3 years ago, Silas had been one of the ghosts. He had boarded a ship in Liverpool with nothing but a sturdy coat and a head full of impossible dreams. The neighbors had shaken their heads, predicting he would die in a ditch in New York or be swallowed by the wilderness beyond. But the letters that came back, infrequent, expensive, and written on crisp, clean paper, told a different story. "The air is sweet here, Elias," Silas had written in the last missive. "It doesn't taste of sulfur. I am working on the railroad in the west. They say the steel lines are stitching the country together like a giant scar. The pay is good, more than you can imagine. They say a man with a strong back and a willing heart can own land here. Not rent, own. Leave the gray behind, brother. Come to the horizon." Elias looked up from the streets. The horizon in Manchester was blocked by row after row of slums. But Silas spoke of a horizon that stretched forever, a place where the sun actually set and the ground wasn't covered in refuse. He began the walk home, his boots heavy on the uneven stones. The wind cut through his thin jacket, reminding him of the coming winter. Last winter, the fever had taken his youngest son, little Samuel. It wasn't the disease that killed him, Elias knew bitterly. It was the cold and the damp and the lack of food to keep a fire burning. He remembered the small, frozen body and the look on his wife Mary's face as she had sat by the bed, her eyes dry but screaming with a grief that had never truly left her. She was a husk of the woman he had married, her spirit broken by the relentless grind of poverty. He turned the corner onto Miller Street. The smell of the privy and unwashed bodies assaulted him. He climbed the narrow, dark stairs to their rooms on the 3rd floor. As he opened the door, the familiar sounds greeted him. The hacking cough of the old woman next door, the crying of a baby 2 floors down, and the silence of his own home. Mary was sitting by the window, mending a shirt by the dying light of the evening. She didn't look up as he entered. She was 30, but she looked 50. Her hair, once a vibrant red, was now dull and pulled back severely. "I'm home," Elias said, softly. She nodded, not looking up from her needle. "Did you get the extra shift for tomorrow?" "No," Elias said, his voice tight. "The foreman gave it to O'Malley, said O'Malley has 5 mouths to feed. We only have 3. Mary's hand paused for a fraction of a second before she resumed sewing. "We have bread. There is a bit of lard left. We will survive." "Survive," Elias whispered. The word tasted like ash. "Is that all it is, Mary? Just surviving? Until the fever takes us or the mill takes our fingers?" "Don't start, Elias," she warned, a weary edge to her voice.
We have talked about this. Dreams don't put bread on the table. Silas was a fool to leave. He is probably dead in a ditch somewhere, and those letters are forgeries sent to trick you." "He is not dead," Elias said, his volume rising. He pulled the crumpled letter from his pocket and slammed it on the table. "He is in a place called Wyoming. He is building a railroad. He says the sky is bigger than the whole of England." Mary finally looked up, her eyes filled with a deep, ancient sadness. "And what would we do? We have no money for the tickets. It costs a fortune to cross that ocean. We are bound here, tied to the stone and the soot." Elias took a deep breath. He reached into his ever pocket and pulled out a small, heavy pouch. He let it drop onto the table. It clinked heavily, a sound that was foreign in their home. Mary stared at it. "What is that?" "It's the savings from the guild before it collapsed. I've been adding to it, scraps here and there, selling my tools. It's not enough for all of us, but—" He couldn't finish the sentence. He had been planning this for months. Every penny he had saved from gambling, from extra shifts, from selling the few possessions they had left, had gone into that pouch. Mary picked it up, her hands trembling. She loosened the drawstring and looked inside. Gold coins glittered in the dim light. "It's enough for the steerage passage," Elias said, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. "For you, for me, and for Clara. We can go. We can leave." Mary stared at the coins as if they were burning coals. Then she looked at the empty corner of the room where Samuel's crib used to be. "It's dangerous," she whispered. "The ocean. People say it takes weeks. The sickness, the storms. And what awaits us? Savages? Wild animals?" "Freedom," Elias said, stepping closer to her. He took her calloused hands in his. "Silas is there. He says they need men. He says a man can own a piece of the earth he walks on. I don't want our daughter to grow up in this darkness, Mary. I want her to see the sun. I want her to breathe air that doesn't taste of coal." Tears finally spilled from Mary's eyes, cutting tracks through the dirt on her cheeks. She looked at the door, then at the window, as if seeing their prison for the first time. "It's madness," she sobbed, clutching his hands. "Utter madness." "Aye," Elias smiled, a sad, broken smile that held the first spark of hope he had felt in years. "But perhaps that is what we need, a little madness to save us." The preparations were a blur of frantic, furtive activity. They couldn't tell the neighbors. If the landlord found out they were leaving, he would demand 6 months' rent up front, knowing they would never pay. They sold everything they couldn't carry: the bed, the table, the few china plates Mary had inherited from her mother. It wasn't much, but it added a few more silvers to the pouch. 3 days later, in the pre-dawn chill, they slipped out of Miller Street. Elias carried a trunk containing their worldly possessions: sturdy clothes, linen, the Bible, and the locket with Samuel's hair inside. Mary carried Clara, who was wrapped in a heavy shawl, her eyes wide with confusion and sleep. The train ride to Liverpool was a journey into the unknown for Clara, who had never left the city. She pointed at the green fields flashing by the window, laughing at the sheep. Elias watched her, his heart aching. She was so small, so fragile. Was he being selfish? Was he leading them to their doom? But as they approached Liverpool, the sight of the ships in the harbor silenced his doubts. The Mersey estuary was a forest of masts and funnels. Great steamships, iron leviathans, sat low in the water, puffing smoke into the sky like the very mills they were escaping. But here, the smoke smelled of salt and adventure, not despair. They navigated the crowded docks, a chaotic babel of languages. They saw Jews fleeing pogroms in Russia, Italians with heavy bundles, Germans with stoic faces. They were all part of the great river of humanity flowing toward the new world. They found the booking office and then the holding area for the steerage passengers. The queue was long, snaking around the pier like a wounded serpent. The air smelled of unwashed bodies, salt water, and fear. "Papers," the ticket master barked, not looking up from his ledger. Elias slapped his documents on the wooden counter. The clerk, with spectacles thick as bottle bottoms, inspected them with disdain. Thorn, Mary, Clara, steerage class, deck C, below the waterline. No complaints allowed, no refunds. If you die, you get buried at sea. Next. He shoved the tickets back at them. Elias grabbed them, his heart pounding. They were on the ship, the city of New York, a majestic side-wheel steamer that towered above them like a cliff.
The morning sun did not rise, it ignited. One moment, the horizon was a bruised purple. The next, it was ablaze with a light so fierce it made Elias Thorne squint even through the grime on his face. The city of New York gave a final, shuddering groan as its engines died, replaced by the chaotic symphony of the greatest harbor in the world. Whistles shrieked, chains rattled like the bones of giants, and voices shouted in a dozen tongues. The air that rushed in to replace the stale below-deck atmosphere smelled not of coal and sweat, but of something strange and electric. Ozone, roasting peanuts, horse manure, and raw ambition. "Papa, look!" Clara cried, pointing a trembling finger. Elias followed her gaze. There, standing on a granite pedestal in the middle of the bay, was a woman. She was colossal, a copper giant draped in robes that looked heavy enough to sink a ship, her arm raised high, holding a torch that blazed with a golden, unnatural fire. It was the Statue of Liberty, dedicated only a year prior. Up close, she wasn't just a symbol, she was a guardian. She stared out to sea with an impassive face, welcoming the tired, the poor, the huddled masses yearning to breathe free. "She's holding the light," Clara whispered, pressing her face against the rail. "Is she waiting for us?" "She's waiting for everyone, love," Elias said, his voice thick. He adjusted the strap of their trunk. It felt heavier now, burdened not just with clothes, but with the weight of 1,000 stares. The euphoria of sighting land quickly curdled into anxiety as the reality of the docking process set in. The ship did not simply tie up and let them off. The city of New York was a microcosm of the society they were entering. While Elias and the rest of the steerage passengers were kept waiting on the sweltering lower decks, a separate gangplank was lowered on the upper deck. Elias watched from the stairwell, hidden in the shadows, as the first-class passengers descended. Men in frock coats and top hats, women with bustles and parasols, their faces untouched by the sun or the wind. They walked with an easy confidence, stepping onto the gangplank as if they owned the very air. They were greeted by porters who bowed and scraped, whisking their mountains of leather luggage away toward carriages waiting on the cobblestones below. Then the shout came down. "Steerage, prepare to debark!" It was not an invitation, it was an order. The mood in the lower decks shifted from wonder to fear. People scrambled to gather their meager belongings, fighting for space in the narrow corridors. There was a desperation in the air, a palpable terror that if they weren't fast enough, or if they didn't have the right papers, the gates would close forever. "Stay close," Elias barked, grabbing Mary's arm and pulling Clara against his leg. "Do not let go of my hand. Whatever happens, do not let go." They were herded onto the main deck, blinking in the harsh sunlight, and then directed towards a steep, narrow gangplank that looked down into the churning water. To Elias, it felt like walking a tightrope over the abyss. At the bottom, they were not met by carriages, but by a barricade of wooden fencing and a sea of uniformed officials. The noise was deafening. Men with megaphones barked orders in English, German, and Yiddish. "Papers! Show your papers!" They were shuffled into a large, chaotic holding area on the pier, a shed that smelled of wet wool and fear. This was the gateway, and it was guarded by men with clipboards who held the power of gods over them. One scratch of a pen and you were on a boat back to Europe. Elias had spent the entire voyage studying the papers Silas had sent, memorizing the details, practicing his answers. He approached the first table with his chest out, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. "Name?" the clerk asked, not looking up. He was a small man with a mustache that twitched with irritation. "Elias Thorne, and this is my wife, Mary, and daughter, Clara." "Country of origin?" "England, Manchester." "Occupation?" "Miller, textile." The clerk flipped through a ledger, his fingers stained with ink. He looked up, his eyes scanning Elias's face. It wasn't a friendly look, it was a clinical assessment, looking for signs of lunacy, weakness, or criminality. He looked at Mary, who was pale and trembling, and then at Clara, who was hiding behind her mother's skirt. "Health inspection, next line." Elias let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. The next line was worse. Here, doctors in white coats moved like predators through the crowd. They didn't ask questions, they observed. They looked for the lazy eye of trachoma, a blanket over the head to check for senility, a limp that suggested a weak back. A doctor with a bristly white beard stopped in front of them. He reached out with a gloved hand and turned Clara's face towards the light. Clara whimpered, tears springing to her eyes. Elias's hand balled into a fist in his pocket. "Open your mouth," the doctor commanded. He used a tongue depressor, a rough wooden stick, to peer down her throat. He checked her neck for swollen glands. He looked at her scalp. He grunted, moved to Mary, checked her eyes quickly, and then finally Elias. He didn't say a word, merely used a piece of chalk to mark a symbol on the shoulder of Elias's coat. Elias flinched, terrified it was a cross, a rejection, but he looked down. It was a simple EK for eyes keen. They had passed. "Final registration, then you are free," a guard shouted. They moved to the final table. An older man with kind eyes sat there. He stamped their papers with a loud thud that echoed like a gunshot. "Welcome to America," he said, the first words of kindness they had heard from leaving the ship. They walked out of the processing shed and onto the streets of New York. It was a sensory explosion that nearly knocked Elias off his feet. The sheer scale of it was staggering. He had seen the crowded streets of London, but this was different. This was vertical. Buildings of brick and stone rose 5, 6, 7 stories into the air, scraping the smoke-soaked sky. The street was a river of mud and horse manure churned by iron wagon wheels. Elevated trains rattled overhead on steel tracks, casting spiderweb shadows on the pavement below. The noise was a physical assault. Horses clopping, newsboys shouting, "Extra! Extra!" The clatter of carriage wheels, the hiss of steam vents. And the people, Elias had never seen such diversity. Men in turbans walked alongside Orthodox Jews with long beards. Italian women with black shawls chattered next to Irish laborers in flat caps. The air smelled of roasting chestnuts, fresh bread, stale beer, and the raw metallic tang of industry. It's alive," Mary whispered, clutching her shawl tight around her shoulders. She looked overwhelmed, her eyes darting nervously at the passing crowds. "Silas said to go to the ticket office, the Grand Central Depot. We need to get to Wyoming." They began to walk. Elias had a small hand-drawn map Silas had included in his letter, but the city was a labyrinth. Every street corner seemed to bring a new challenge. As they navigated the labyrinth of the Lower East Side, Elias felt the weight of his desperation. He was a marked man, not by the government, but by the city itself. He carried all their remaining money in his belt, a thick roll of banknotes that represented his life savings and his brother's hard work. "Hey, you, English!" The voice cut through the noise. Elias ignored it, pulling Clara along. "Hey, Greenhorn, I'm talking to you!" A hand grabbed Elias's shoulder. He spun around, ready to fight. A young man stood there, maybe 20 years old, dressed in a flashy checkered suit and a derby hat that sat too low on his forehead. He had a smile that showed too many teeth. You look lost, pal. Need a place to stay? Need a ticket? I can get you anywhere you want to go, half price." Elias knew exactly what this was. Silas had warned him about the runners, sharks who patrolled the docks looking for fresh immigrants to rob. They would promise cheap tickets or boarding houses and then steal everything you owned. "I know where I'm going," Elias said, his voice hard. He turned to walk away. Come on, don't be like that." The man said, stepping in front of them, blocking the path.
You got a little girl there. It's hot. I got a cold drink inside my establishment just right there, on the house." Mary flinched, pulling Clara back. Elias put a hand on the trunk, ready to swing it if he had to. "I said get out of my way," Elias growled. He locked eyes with the man, channeling the anger he had felt at the mill foreman for years. He didn't look like a victim. He looked like a man who had nothing to lose. The runner hesitated. He read the menace in Elias's eyes. He looked at the crowd around them. A nearby police officer was watching the interaction with interest. The runner held up his hands, feigning innocence. All right. No charity for the proud, huh? Suit yourself." He tipped his hat mockingly and vanished into the crowd. Elias let out a shaky breath. Mary looked at him, her eyes wide. "How did you know?" she asked. "He wanted us to go into a building," Elias said. "Silas wrote, 'Stay on the street, never go inside with a stranger. The street is dangerous, but it's honest. The shadows are where they kill you.'" They continued their march uptown. The streets gradually changed. The slums of the waterfront gave way to the bustling commerce of the shopping districts. The mud became cobblestone. The crowds became slightly more genteel. Finally, they turned a corner and saw it, the Grand Central Depot. It was a sprawling palace of glass and iron, a cathedral of travel. Trains hissed and chugged on endless tracks, their smokestacks billowing white clouds that drifted up to join the city smog. Inside the main concourse, the noise echoed off the high vaulted ceiling. It was a cavern of light and motion. A giant board hung from the ceiling, listing destinations that sounded like fairy tales: Chicago, St. Louis, Denver, San Francisco.
The rhythm of the iron wheels became a heartbeat that thrummed through the floorboards, into the soles of their boots and settled deep within their chests. Clack, 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 whoosh. For the first 2 days, the sound was a novelty, a lullaby of progress. By the third day, as the train churned westward past Chicago and into the flat expanse of the Illinois prairie, it had become a relentless drone that vibrated in their teeth. Elias Thorne sat on the wooden bench of the emigrant car, his back against the hard slats, staring out the window that was streaked with soot and dust. The landscape was changing with a terrifying monotony. The rolling green hills of the east had surrendered to a vast, undulating ocean of grass. It was beautiful in its way, a sea of gold and green that stretched to the edge of the world, but it was also indifferent. There were no walls, no fences, no markers of human civilization, save for the twin ribbons of steel cutting through the earth. "It never ends," Mary whispered. She sat opposite him, clutching Clara, who was asleep with her head in her mother's lap. Mary looked pale, the dark circles under her eyes standing out starkly against her pale skin. "Elias, look at it. There is nothing out there, just grass and sky." "That's the point, Mary," Elias said, though his voice lacked the conviction he tried to project. "Room to grow, no one crowding you." "It looks lonely," she murmured, pulling her shawl tighter as a draft whistled through the poorly fitted window frame. "It looks like God turned his back and left us to the wolves." The car they rode in was a rough approximation of comfort. It was a long wooden box smelling of wet wool, stale tobacco, and the unwashed bodies of 50 people. The benches were designed for efficiency, not rest. At night, the passengers had to contort themselves into impossible positions, using bundles of clothes as pillows. Every snore, every cough, every cry of a baby echoed in the cavernous space. Sharing their bench was an old man named Mr. Abernathy. He was a wiry scarecrow of a man with skin like tanned leather and a beard that had gone gray long ago. He wore a battered Stetson hat that he refused to take off even to sleep. He claimed to be a prospector, returning from a failed claim in the Black Hills. "Don't let the lady worry," Abernathy rasped, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into a brass spittoon near his feet. "The plains have a way of making a man feel small, that's all. You city folk, you're used to buildings boxing you in. Makes you feel safe. Out here, you're an ant on a table. The wind, the sun, the storms, they don't care if you live or die. You have to earn your place." "I intend to," Elias said curtly. He didn't like the old man's tone. It felt like a challenge.
Abernathy cackled, a dry, rattling sound. "We all intend to, son. I intended to find gold. I intended to build a mansion. Instead, I found burrs, dysentery, and debt. The West eats dreams, English. It chews 'em up and spits out bones. You better pray your brother is real, because out here, family is the only thing that stands between you and the coyotes." Elias looked away, staring out the window again. The sun was beginning to set, painting the endless sky in streaks of violent orange and purple. It was a beauty that hurt the eyes. As the days bled into one another, the train became a rolling village. The passengers, a motley collection of immigrants from Ireland, Germany, Scandinavia, and Italy, formed a fragile community. They shared hard bread and dried apples. They traded stories of the old world and hopes for the new one. Clara, resilient in the way only children can be, became the ward of the car. She wandered up and down the aisle, charming coins out of pockets and learning snippets of languages she didn't understand. She would press her face to the glass, shouting with delight whenever she saw a herd of antelope bounding effortlessly alongside the tracks, or a prairie dog town sending sentries up to watch the iron beast pass. But the journey was not without its terrors. On the 5th day, the weather turned. The blue sky vanished, replaced by a bruised, boiling mass of clouds that stretched from the ground to the heavens. The wind picked up, screaming across the open prairie, hitting the side of the train with the force of a physical blow. "Storm comin'!" the conductor shouted as he walked through the car, securing the shutters. The rain fell in sheets, blindingly thick, hammering against the roof of the car like 1,000 hammer strikes. The train slowed, the wheels fighting for traction on the slick rails. The car swayed violently, lamps swinging crazily from the ceiling, casting dancing shadows that looked like demons. Suddenly, there was a crack of thunder that shook the floorboards, louder than anything Elias had ever heard. The train lurched, brakes screeching, throwing passengers from their seats. "What is it?" Mary screamed, clutching Clara as the little girl began to cry. "Stay down!" Elias roared, shielding them with his body. The train ground to a halt. The silence that followed the cessation of movement was almost as loud as the storm, broken only by the hiss of steam and the relentless drumming of the rain. A moment later, the door to our car slid open. The wind rushed in, carrying a smell that Elias had never encountered before. Ozone, wet earth, and something sharp and metallic. "The bridge ahead is washed out," the conductor yelled over the gale. "We're stuck here until the water recedes. Nobody leaves the train." They sat there for hours, the darkness pressing against the windows. Abernathy sat calmly, whittling a piece of wood with a pocket knife. "Tornado passed nearby," he said, not looking up. "Lucky we didn't get picked up and thrown into Kansas." Elias looked at Mary. Her face was buried in Clara's hair. He reached out and took her hand. It was ice cold. "We're close," he lied. "Just a little longer." By the next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and shimmering. The train lurched forward, crawling across a temporary trestle the crew had built to bypass the washed-out section. And then, the landscape changed forever. They left the plains behind and began the climb. The rolling green hills of the east had surrendered to a vast, undulating ocean of grass. It was beautiful in its way, a sea of gold and green that stretched to the edge of the world, but it was also indifferent. There were no walls, no fences, no markers of human civilization, save for the twin ribbons of steel cutting through the earth. Venilios saw them. He had seen illustrations in books, but nothing could prepare him for the reality. To the west, rising from the earth like jagged teeth biting into the sky, were the Rocky Mountains. They were monstrous, walls of granite and snow that defied comprehension. They were purple and gray in the morning light, capped with white glaciers that gleamed like bone. The train groaned and heaved as it began the steep ascent, the engine working harder, black smoke billowing backward over the cars. Elias stood at the window, his mouth open. It was terrifyingly beautiful. In Manchester, a hill was a place to sled. Here, a mountain was a barrier, a challenge, a wall that said, "You shall not pass." Mary stood beside him, holding Clara's hand. Even Mary, who had cursed the wilderness, fell silent. There was a majesty here that demanded respect. "Is Silas there?" she asked, pointing a trembling finger at the peaks. "On the other side," Elias said. "They're building the line through the passes." The journey through the mountains took days. They traveled through tunnels carved with blasting powder, where the darkness was absolute and the air was thick with smoke. They crossed trestle bridges that spanned bottomless canyons, the river below looking like a silver thread. Looking down, Elias saw the wreckage of old trains, wooden skeletons lying twisted at the bottom of the ravines, a reminder of the cost of this road. The cold seeped into their bones. The emigrant car had no stove. They huddled together under their blankets, sharing body heat. Clara developed a rasping cough that kept Elias awake all night. He prayed to every saint he could remember, promising anything, everything, just to keep her breathing. Finally, the train crested the summit. The descent began, and the view opened up. The mountains fell away behind them, and ahead lay a vast basin. It was greener than the plains they had left before, framed by more distant ranges. It looked like a bowl of paradise. "Cheyenne!" the conductor shouted, walking through the car. "Next stop, Cheyenne! End of the line for now!" The car erupted in activity. People began to gather their belongings, a chaotic mix of excitement and anxiety. The sudden return to civilization, or at least the approximation of it, was jarring. Elias strapped the trunk shut. He helped Mary adjust her bonnet. He straightened his own coat, trying to look like a man who belonged in this wild country. The train slowed, the whistle blowing a long, mournful note that echoed off the canyon walls. They pulled into the station. Cheyenne was not the grand metropolis Elias had imagined. It was a sprawling, dusty frontier town, a chaotic mix of tents and wooden buildings that seemed to have grown out of the prairie like weeds. The streets were mud and dust, filled with wagons, horsemen, and soldiers in blue uniforms. The smell hit them first, not the coal smoke of the train, but the scent of horses, sawdust, unwashed bodies, and whiskey. As the train hissed to a stop, Elias stood on the platform, looking out over the crowd. His heart hammered against his ribs. Silas was supposed to be here. "Stay here," he told Mary and Clara, though he knew he couldn't leave them alone in the crush. He took Clara's hand and gripped Mary's arm. Stick together. They stepped down onto the wooden platform. It was swarming with people. Porters shouting, newsboys hawking the Cheyenne leader, cowboys leaning against the rails, spitting and watching the newcomers with amused eyes. Elias scanned the faces. They were hard faces, weather-beaten, scarred.
The wagon ride from Cheyenne to the railroad camp was not a journey, it was a beating. The wooden wheels, rimmed with iron, crashed over ruts and rocks that the wagon path disguised as a road. Elias held on to the side rail with a white-knuckled grip, his teeth rattling in his skull. Beside him, Mary did her best to shield Clara from the worst of the dust, wrapping the girl in a makeshift tent of shawls. But the fine yellow powder of the Wyoming plains found its way into everything: their eyes, their noses, the creases of their clothes. Silas drove the team of mules with a practiced hand, flicking the reins and calling out curses that were half prayer, half command. He didn't speak much, his eyes scanning the horizon, watching for the clouds of dust that signaled a stampede or a storm. "There!" Silas shouted over the creaking of the wood, pointing ahead with his whip. "Hell on wheels!" Elias squinted. At first, it looked like a smear of dirt on the landscape. As they drew closer, the smear resolved itself into a sprawling, chaotic village of tents and wooden shanties that moved like a parasite alongside the twin steel rails of the Union Pacific. It was a town without foundations, a temporary city of vice and industry. Elias saw the gambling tents with their flaps thrown open, revealing men hunched over cards inside. He saw saloons constructed from rough-hewn planks, the sounds of piano music spilling out into the dry air, discordant and lonely. And beyond the glitter of the Vice District lay the camp itself, a sea of canvas tents where the workers slept, row upon row of them, temporary graves for the living. "Is this it?" Mary asked, her voice barely audible. She looked at the saloons with wide, frightened eyes. "Is this where we live?"
Not there, Silas said, spitting to the side. The sinkhole is for the fools with money to burn. We live in the shanties. I've got a cabin frame up about a mile back. Silas steered the wagon past the main drag. The smell hit him then, a thick, choking mix of unwashed bodies, manure, cheap whiskey, and the acrid stench of sulfur from the black powder used in the blasting. It was the smell of progress, raw and ugly. They arrived at Silas's home. It was a single room, built from scrap lumber and scavenged railroad ties. The roof was canvas, weighted down with stones. It was small, drafty, and sat directly on the hard-packed earth. Compared to the cramped rooms in Manchester, it was a palace. Compared to the dreams Silas had sold them in his letters, it was a shelter for animals. "It's dry," Silas said defensively, jumping down from the wagon, "and I've got a stove. It keeps the cold out." Elias helped Mary and Clara down. They stood in the doorway, looking out at the vast, empty nothingness that surrounded the camp. The silence here was heavy, broken only by the distant rhythmic thunder of the steam engines working the grading lines further up the track. "It's fine, Silas," Elias said, forcing a smile he didn't feel. "It has 4 walls and a door. That's more than we had a week ago." They settled in quickly, driven by necessity. There was no time for sentiment. The work didn't stop because a family arrived. The next morning, before the sun had even breached the horizon, Silas woke Elias with a rough shake. "Up, English. The rails don't lay themselves." Elias groaned, his body stiff from the wagon ride. He dressed in the clothes Silas gave him, heavy canvas trousers, a flannel shirt, and boots with toes reinforced with steel. He felt like a walking anvil. They ate a breakfast of salt pork and hardtack biscuits that tasted like sawdust. Then they walked out into the twilight. The camp was already moving. Men emerged from the tents like zombies, shuffling toward the mess shacks for coffee before heading to the line. There was a grim camaraderie here, a shared understanding that they were all cogs in a vast machine. As the sun crested the hills, painting the sky in hues of bruised orange, Elias saw the true scale of the operation. To the west, a vast army of men, Irish, Chinese, freed slaves, Civil War veterans, were attacking the earth. "Hurry up," a foreman bellowed, a man with a red face and a bulging neck. "We got 3 miles of grading to do before noon. Move!" Silas led Elias to a flatbed car loaded with iron rails. Each rail weighed 500 pounds. They were sleek, heavy, and cold. "Grab a tongs," Silas said, pointing to a pair of large iron pincers laying on the ground. "You and me are on the detail. We lay the tie, we set the rail, we spike it down." Elias looked at the rail, then at the ground stretching to the mountains. "All the way to the mountains?" "All the way to the Pacific," Silas grunted. The work began. It was a nightmare of physical exertion that made the textile mill feel like a library. Elias's job was to grip the red-hot rail with the tongs, lifting it in perfect synchronization with 5 other men. On a shout, they had to walk in unison, carrying the beast of steel to the ties, dropping it into the chair where it belonged with a ringing clang. "Down!" Silas shouted. The rail hit the wood. The shock wave vibrated up Elias's arms, rattling his teeth. Before he could catch his breath, the spikers were in. Men with sledgehammers swung the heavy iron tools with lethal precision, driving the spikes through the pre-drilled holes. Tang, tang, tang. The sound was deafening. It wasn't the rhythmic clatter of a loom. It was the percussion of violence. By midday, the sun was a hammer. The air shimmered with heat. Sweat poured off Elias, drenching his shirt, stinging his eyes. His hands were blistered within an hour, the skin rubbing raw against the iron handle of the tongs. He couldn't stop to wipe them. If he let go, the 500 pounds of steel would crush the foot of the man next to him. "Focus, Elias," Silas roared, his face streaked with black dust and grease. "Don't think about the heat. Don't think about the pain. Just count. 1, 2, lift. 1, 2, drop." Elias fell into the trance. He became a machine. His back screamed, His lungs burned as he inhaled the dust, but he didn't stop. To stop was to admit defeat. To stop was to be crushed. Around lunchtime, a nearby section of the camp erupted in cheers. Elias looked over to see a group of Chinese workers. They were laying track faster than any crew Elias had seen. They moved with a fluid, rhythmic grace, singing a high-pitched melodic song that seemed to coordinate their movements. Coolies, a burly Irishman next to Elias, spat on the ground. They work like ants, taking the food from our mouths, they are. They work like men, Silas snapped, wiping sweat from his forehead, and they get paid less than you do. Save your breath for the rail, Pat. The Chinese crews are the only reason we're ahead of schedule. The tension was palpable. The camp was a powder keg of ethnic rivalries, kept from exploding only by the crushing weight of the work. There was no energy left for hate when you were hauling steel under a merciless sun. Later that afternoon, the monotony shattered. They were working near a cut in a hillside. Above them, a separate crew was blasting rock to clear the way for the grade. The warning whistle blew, one long blast and three short. "Fire in the hole!" the cry went out, rippling down the line. The men dropped flat, covering their heads with their arms. Elias pressed his face into the dirt. He felt the ground shudder beneath him a split second before the sound hit. Boom! A shower of rocks and dust rained down on them, pelting their backs. Elias waited for the silence, but instead there was a sickening crack, followed by a scream. "Rock slide!" someone screamed. Elias looked up. A slab of granite the size of a wagon had broken loose from the cut above. It bounced down the slope, missing the track where Elias lay by inches, and slammed into the supply wagon below. The screams weren't from the wagon. They were from the men who had been too slow to move. Elias scrambled to his feet, his heart hammering in his throat. "Get the doctor," Silas shouted, sprinting toward the wreckage. Elias ran after him. The scene was a chaotic mess of dust and blood. A young man, no older than 18, was pinned under the shattered wheel of the wagon, his leg twisted at an impossible angle. Dust covered his face, turning his gasping breaths into wet, bubbling sounds. "Lift it," Silas roared, grabbing the splintered wood of the wagon. Elias and three other men threw themselves against the heavy iron axle. The weight was immense. Elias's feet slipped in the gravel. He gritted his teeth, feeling the muscles in his neck bunch into cables. "On three," Silas yelled. "1, 2, lift!" They heaved. The iron groaned, and the wagon lifted an inch. The boy screamed as they dragged him out, his leg a mangled ruin of blood and bone. Elias looked down at his hands. They were covered in the boy's blood. It was bright red against the black grease of the rail. The smell of copper mixed with the smell of sulfur. This was the blood part of the bargain. Elias knew the work would be hard. He had expected sweat, but he hadn't truly understood that the rails were stained with it. The West wasn't just being conquered by steel. It was being paid for in limbs and lives. They worked until the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long violet shadows across the plains. The air cooled rapidly, the temperature dropping as if a door had been opened to a freezer. When the final whistle blew, signaling the end of the shift, Elias didn't cheer. He couldn't lift his arms. He collapsed onto the side of the grade, his chest heaving.
The rhythm of the hammer, the tang, tang, tang that drove the spikes into the iron, had become a metronome for Elias Thorne's life. But lately, the rhythm was off. The hammer would fall, and instead of driving the spike home, it felt as though he were driving his own thoughts deeper into the dark recesses of his mind. It had been 2 months since they arrived at the end of the tracks. The camp moved with the rails, inching westward like a massive segmented caterpillar. The landscape was changing again. The vast open plains were giving way to the rugged foothills of the Rockies. The air grew thinner, colder at night, and the wind carried a constant, mournful whistle through the passes. Elias was losing weight, his frame leaner, harder, but his eyes were growing hollow. He worked with a ferocity that frightened Silas. He didn't talk during the breaks. He didn't joke with the other men. He just stared at the horizon, or worse, at his own hands. One afternoon, the heat was blistering,
reflecting off the granite faces of the cliffs they were carving a road through. The air smelled of sulfur and sweat. "Gang, hold up!" the foreman shouted. "Blasting crew is setting charges." The men dropped their tools, seeking what little shade they could find near the water wagons. Elias sat on a crate, wiping the grime from his forehead with a red bandana. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the small leather locket he always kept there. Inside were 2 locks of hair, one dark, one fair. Mary's and Samuel's. He opened it, his thumb tracing the tiny painted face of his son. In the harsh sunlight, the memory of Samuel's death felt fresh, raw. It wasn't the fever he remembered anymore. It was the coldness of the room in Manchester, the feeling of helplessness, the guilt of being the father who couldn't provide enough coal to keep the fire burning, the guilt of being alive while his son was buried in the cold, wet earth of England. "You're staring a hole in that thing, English," a voice said. Elias looked up. It was Pat, the Irishman he had worked alongside for weeks. Pat was a boulder of a man, arms thick as tree trunks, with a face that looked like it had been chiseled out of rock. "It helps," Elias muttered, snapping the locket shut. "Keeps me grounded." "Or it drags you down," Pat said, leaning back against a crate and crossing his arms. "I lost a wife and 2 girls back in the famine. I left them in a mass grave in Cork. If I carried their faces in my pocket every day, I wouldn't have the strength to lift a shovel. The past is a shadow, Elias. You stand in your own light. You cast a shadow on the future." "I don't want to forget him," Elias snapped, his voice sharper than he intended. "Forget? No, but you have to put the ghost to bed. You're walking around like a man possessed. I saw you yesterday. You nearly took your own hand off with the sledgehammer. You lose focus out here, and the West will kill you just as fast as the fever did him." Elias didn't answer. He stood up as the blast whistle blew, 3 short shrieks. He grabbed his hammer, but Pat's words gnawed at him. "You stand in your own light." That evening, after the shift ended, Elias didn't go back to the cabin immediately. He needed to escape. The claustrophobia of the small shack, the worry in Mary's eyes, the innocent questions from Clara, it was all suffocating him. He walked into the hell-on-wheels tent town. The sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the dirt. The camp was coming alive. Fiddle music drifted from the saloons, mixed with the raucous laughter of men paid and drunk. Elias avoided the gambling tents where Silas occasionally lost his wages. He found a smaller, dimmer saloon at the edge of town called the Rusty Spoke. He pushed through the swinging doors, the smell of stale beer and sawdust washing over him. He sat at the corner of the bar, away from the poker tables. He ordered a whiskey, cheap, burning rye that tasted like kerosene. He drank it in one gulp, feeling the fire spread through his chest, temporarily numbing the cold ache of grief. "You look like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders." A smooth, cultured voice slid over the noise of the room. Elias turned. He stood next to him was a man who looked like he didn't belong in a railroad camp. He was dressed in a black suit that was immaculately pressed, a crisp white shirt, and a string tie. His hair was oiled and combed perfectly, and he held a glass of amber liquid with delicate fingers. His eyes were dark, calculating, and cold. "I'm just tired," Elias grunted. "We're all tired, but you have the look of a man running from a ghost, or maybe running to catch one." "Who are you?" "I am called the Commodore," the man said with a slight bow. "I deal in investments. I deal in futures." "I work the rail," Elias said. "I don't have money for investments." The Commodore laughed, a soft, dangerous sound. "Money isn't the only currency out here, my friend. Dreams, debts, sins, they all have value. I saw you looking at that locket earlier. Hard to miss the pain in a man's eyes." Elias stiffened. "Leave it be." "I mean no offense," the Commodore said, leaning in closer. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "I merely recognize a fellow sufferer. I, too, have lost. I, too, have regrets. That is why I play. The cards are honest. They don't care about your past. They only care about the hand you hold." He gestured toward the back room, where a high-stakes poker game was underway. The men there were not the common laborers. They were foremen, land speculators, the contractors who fed off the railroad's progress. "I have a seat open at my table," the Commodore said smoothly. "A chance to turn that sweat of yours into something more. Your brother is a good man, but he's a creature of the hammer. You have a thinker's eyes and a gambler's desperation." Elias looked toward the room. He remembered the empty larder in Manchester. He remembered the doctor's bill they couldn't pay. He remembered the look on Mary's face when she had to sell her wedding ring to buy food for Clara. He looked at the rough hands that gripped the glass, hands scarred by steel and splinters. He had $30 in his pocket, a week's wages. It was meant for new boots for Mary. The winter was coming, and her shoes were worn through. "Just a hand," Elias whispered, more to himself than to the Commodore. "The luck of the draw, perhaps," the Commodore smiled, revealing teeth that were too white, or perhaps fate. Elias followed him into the back room. The air was thick with cigar smoke. The table was covered in green felt, littered with chips and coins. He sat down, his heart hammering against his ribs. The Commodore sat opposite him, shuffling the deck with a practiced, fluid grace. The first hour was a blur. He lost $10, then won back 20. The whiskey flowed, provided freely by the house. His head swam, but for the first time in years he wasn't thinking about Samuel. He wasn't thinking about the cold ground. He was thinking about the cards, the rush of the possibility of escape. Then the stakes went up. The Commodore pushed a stack of chips into the center. "I raise you 50. "50, Elias gasped. "That's more than I have." "The locket," the Commodore said, his eyes glinting in the lantern light. "Gold is gold, and the sentiment inside, that must be worth something." A cold chill cut through the alcohol-induced haze. The locket, all he had left of Samuel. "No," Elias said, "not that." "Then fold," the Commodore dismissed him. "Walk back to your shack, poor and tired. Watch your wife shiver this winter because you didn't have the courage to bet on a better life." The words hit Elias like a whip. Poor and tired. That's what he was. That's what he would always be. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a pioneer. He was a mill worker who got lucky on a boat. He looked at the pile of money. With that, he could buy Mary a coat, Clara a pony, himself a pistol to protect them. He could buy peace. "Call," Elias said, his voice trembling. He reached into his shirt and pulled out the locket. He placed it on the green felt. It looked tiny and fragile next to the piles of silver and paper. The Commodore smiled. "Show your hand." Elias laid down the cards. 2 queens. A good hand, but the Commodore's face was a mask, a handsome, empty mask. 2 queens, Elias laughed. "That's one good hand." The Commodore turned over his own cards. 3 kings. "The house always wins, Mr. Thorne." The table erupted in groans and laughter. Elias stared at the cards, the blood draining from his face. He reached for the locket, his hand shaking violently. "Don't," the Commodore said, his hand covering the gold trinket. "It belongs to the pot now. You lost." "No," Elias growled, rising from his chair. The room spun. "Give it back." "The rules of the table are the laws of nature," the Commodore's voice losing its silkiness, turning hard as iron. "Sit down or get out." Elias lunged across the table. He wasn't thinking. He was a grieving father, cornered and frantic. His hand grabbed the Commodore's collar, but
October had come and gone.
leaving the high plains of Wyoming a desolate sweep of amber grass and rust-colored dirt. The air had grown teeth, biting at the cheeks of the men working the grading line. But the weather report from the telegraph station in Cheyenne had been promising. Mild winds, clear skies, a long Indian summer to allow the crews to finish the section of track leading into the Granite Canyon. The morning began with a deception. The sun rose in a dome of cloudless pale blue, the kind of gentle sky that lulls a man into thinking the earth is his friend. The birds sang. The mules in the corrals kicked up their heels. It was a Tuesday that felt like a Sunday. Elias Thorne stood by the flatbed car, holding a pair of iron tongs. Since the night of the gambling incident, a quiet resolve had settled over him. He no longer carried the heavy, desperate shadow of the past. Instead, he carried a focused intensity. He worked with a surgeon's precision, his movements efficient, his silence respectful. "Smells like snow," Silas grunted, sniffing the air. He was leaning against a rail, smoking a cigarette, his eyes scanning the tree line of the distant foothills. "It's 50 degrees, Silas," Elias said, wiping a smear of grease from his cheek. "The foreman said we have 2 weeks of good weather." "The foreman reads papers written by men in suits back east," Silas replied, flicking the ash from his cigarette. "The wind doesn't read papers, and the wind, it's holding its breath." By noon, the breath was released. It didn't start with a gust. It started with a sound, a low-frequency vibration that rattled the loose spikes in the railroad ties. Elias looked up from his work. To the west, over the mountains, a wall of cloud had materialized. It wasn't the fluffy white cumulus of morning. It was a bruised, boiling anvil of black and purple, stretching from the ground to the stratosphere. It was moving toward them with a speed that defied logic, swallowing the horizon as it advanced. "Sky's falling," someone shouted, a note of hysteria in their voice. Within minutes, the temperature plummeted. The gentle warmth of the morning vanished, replaced by a cold so sharp it felt like knives against the skin. The wind hit the camp not as a breeze, but as a physical blow. It tore the canvas tarps off the supply wagons, sent shovels flying like dry leaves, and knocked men off their feet. "Secure the camp," the foreman roared, his voice instantly snatched away by the gale. "Get to the storm cellars, now!" But for the men working on the cuts a mile out from the main camp, there was no time. Elias, Silas, and a crew of 20 were trapped in a shallow excavation when the whiteout struck. One moment they could see the tents of hell on wheels in the distance. The next, the world turned into a swirling wall of milk-white dust and snow. "Grab hands!" Silas screamed, grabbing Elias's wrist with a grip that threatened to crush bone. "Don't let go! If you let go, you're dead!" They huddled together, forming a tight knot of bodies in the center of the cut. The wind howled like 1,000 dying wolves, a shriek that drilled into their ears and drowned out their own thoughts. The snow wasn't falling, it was firing horizontally, driven by a velocity that stripped the paint from the rail cars. "We can't stay here," Elias shouted, his face buried in Silas's shoulder to avoid the stinging ice pellets. "The cut is filling up. We'll be buried." "The camp is that way," Pat the Irishman yelled, pointing vaguely to the left. He was already white, his beard crusted with ice. "I can't see my hand in front of my face," Silas argued. "We walk, we wander off the grade. We drop 100 feet into a ravine." They were trapped in a terrifying limbo. The air was too thin to breathe without gasping. The cold was penetrating their heavy canvas coats, wool shirts, and skin, settling into the marrow of their bones. Then the temperature dropped again. This time, the moisture in the air flash froze. The snow turned to pellets of hard ice. The sound of the wind changed from a howl to a roar like a locomotive engine parked 3 inches from their ears. Elias felt Mary's touch in his mind, the phantom sensation of her hand on his. He thought of Clara in the shack. He had sent them to the main mess hall for lunch, a sturdy building. They were safe. He had to be safe for them.
"The tides!" Elias screamed, the idea coming to him in a flash of desperation. "Follow the track!" "Are you mad?" Pat bellowed. "We're in the middle of a blizzard." "We're walking on the bed," Elias yelled back. "If we stay on the gravel, we stay on the grade. It goes to the camp. Silas, grab a rail." Elias dropped to his knees, the ice pelleting him like buckshot. He reached out into the white void, his gloved fingers scrabbling until they hit the cold, hard steel of the rail. "I have it," Elias shouted. "Everyone, grab the man in front of you. I lead, we crawl." It was madness, crawling on a steel track in the middle of a hurricane of ice, but it was their only lifeline. Elias led, pressing his cheek against the rail to guide himself, inching forward blindly. Behind him, Silas held his ankle. Behind Silas, Pat held Silas. They became a human centipede, dragging themselves through the accumulating drifts. The minutes stretched into hours. Elias's hands went numb, then burned, then went numb again. He lost all sense of time. He could have been crawling for 10 minutes or 10 years. The wind tried to lift him off the ground. He pressed himself flat, fighting the gale with every ounce of his weight. "We can't," a voice from the back cried out. "I can't feel my legs." "Keep moving," Silas shouted, his voice cracking. "If you stop, you die. Move!" They inched forward. Elias's mind began to drift. He saw Samuel's face in the ice. He saw the gray streets of Manchester. The cold was seductive, whispering to him to just sleep, to close his eyes and let the snow cover him like a blanket. "You stand in your own light," Pat's voice echoed in his memory. "No," Elias gritted out, slamming his fist into the iron rail. "Not today." And then the rail ended. Elias's hand hit empty air. He panicked. The track was gone. Had he drifted? "Rail's out," Elias screamed. "Switch track," Silas yelled back. "We must be at the junction." Elias felt around frantically. His hand brushed against a wooden post, a telegraph pole. He grabbed it, hauling himself forward. He felt the insulator. He felt the wire. "Line!" Elias shouted. "Follow the wire!" They changed direction, following the wire toward where the building should be. The wind seemed to redouble its efforts, furious that they were surviving. Suddenly, a dark shape loomed out from the white. It hit Elias in the shoulder hard. He fell back, gasping. It was wood, rough vertical wood. A wall! Elias roared, "The camp! We hit the camp!" They scrambled toward the wall. It was the supply depot. They crawled around the perimeter, finding the door. It was jammed shut by the drifts. Silas threw his shoulder against it. Nothing happened. Elias and Pat joined him. The three of them slammed against the wood, screaming with the effort. With a crack of splintering wood, the door gave an inch, then two. They squeezed through the gap, falling on the floor of the depot, and slammed the door shut. The roar of the wind dampened to a dull shriek. They were inside. It was pitch black, but the air was still. They lay on the floor, gasping for breath, their bodies shaking uncontrollably. We made it," Pat wheezed. He started to laugh, a hysterical sound that quickly turned into sobbing. "Silence," Elias rasped. He struck a match. The flare of light revealed their faces. They were covered in ice, their beards frozen solid. "Where are the others?" Elias asked. "The storm hit too fast," Silas said. "A lot of boys were on the trestle bridge." Outside, the storm raged for 3 days. Inside the shack, the darkness was absolute. Mary and Clara huddled in the corner of the single room, buried under every blanket and quilt they owned, plus the heavy coats Elias and Silas owned. The cabin was groaning, the timbers creaking under the immense weight of the snow piling up against the walls. The wind outside sounded like a beast trying to claw its way in. It screamed down the chimney, fighting against the draft, pushing smoke back into the room. "Please, Elias," Mary prayed. "Please be safe." Suddenly, there was a thump on the roof, a heavy sliding sound. Mary gasped. Was it the roof collapsing? The thump came again, rhythmic. Thump, thump, thump. Mary realized what it was. Someone was on the roof. Someone was shoveling the snow off so the weight wouldn't crush the cabin. "Elias?" Mary whispered into the dark. She scrambled to the door, throwing it open. A wall of snow blocked half the entrance, but a figure was squeezing through the gap. It was a monster of a man, covered in white, carrying a shovel. "Elias?" The man shook the snow from his face. It wasn't Elias, it was Pat. "They're alive, Mary!" Pat shouted over the wind, his voice rough with exhaustion. "They're at the depot, Elias and Silas. They're alive!" Mary let out a sob of relief. "Come in, come in!" "No time," Pat yelled. "The telegraph poles are snapping like twigs. The supply depot roof is buckling. We have to reinforce it, or the men inside are going to be buried. I need help." Mary looked at Clara. She looked at the dying stove. She looked at the storm.
The snow from the storm of the century had been plowed into mountains that lined the streets of the temporary settlement, casting long, cold shadows as the January sun struggled to make its way above the canyon rim. The wind had died, but the temperature had plummeted, freezing the mud of the main drag into rock-hard ridges that made walking a treacherous chore. Elias Thorne walked beside Silas, his breath pluming in the frigid air. They were heading toward the paymaster's tent, a structure heavily guarded by men with Winchesters. It was payday for the grading crew, the first one since the storm had buried the tracks and halted work for 3 weeks. The men were hungry, their pockets empty, and the tension in the air was thicker than the cold smoke. "It feels different today," Elias muttered, pulling his collar up around his ears. He carried a small pistol now, a beat-up .44 Remington that Silas had bought off a departing soldier. It felt heavy and alien against his hip, a lump of iron that contradicted every instinct he had learned in civilized Manchester. "It's payday, Elias," Silas said, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Money brings the sharks and the wolves." "The law?" Elias asked, nodding toward the wooden shack that served as the territorial marshal's office. A man in a star was leaning against the rail, fast asleep, his hat pulled over his eyes. "The law," Silas spat on the frozen ground, "is just another man with a gun who gets paid by the railroad. If we're lucky, he stays asleep." The hell-on-wheels town was no longer just a collection of drinking tents. It had hardened. The storm had driven off the drifters who couldn't survive the cold, leaving behind the hardiest and the most dangerous. Elements of the outlaw gangs that plagued the Union Pacific had drifted in, sensing that the isolated camp was easy pickings. As they approached the line of men waiting for their pay, a ripple of silence moved through the crowd. 3 horses clattered into the center of the square. They were ridden by men who looked like they'd been carved from flint and leather. They wore heavy coats, greasy hats, and bandoliers of ammunition crossed over their chests. The leader, a man with a scar running down his cheek and eyes the color of a storm cloud, reined in his horse, forcing the gathered workers to scatter. "Afternoon, gentlemen," the leader announced. His voice was low, gravelly, and carried easily over the wind. "Name is Clay. My boys and I have been riding the line. Seems there's a rumor that a payroll strongbox just came in from Cheyenne." The marshal didn't stir. Silas stepped forward, placing a hand on Elias's chest to hold him back. "Payday is for the working man, Clay. Take your business elsewhere." Clay looked down at Silas, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his face. "Working man, you lot of slaves to the iron. We're here to liberate the funds. Now, stand aside or get stepped on." "This is a railroad camp," a foreman shouted from the paymaster's tent. "You got no jurisdiction here, Clay." Clay didn't reply with words. He drew his pistol with a speed that blurred the eye. Bang! The foreman's hat flew off his head, spinning into the dust. A neat hole appeared in the wooden post beside his ear. "I have a gun," Clay said, holstering the weapon with a lazy snap. "That's my jurisdiction." The camp froze. It was the raw, naked display of the West's only true tenet. Violence was the ultimate argument. The law didn't matter. Right didn't matter. All that mattered was who could pull the trigger faster. Elias's hand trembled over the butt of his own pistol. He looked at the sleeping marshal. He looked at the terrified faces of the men who had spent weeks digging out of the snow. He looked at Clay, who was grinning like he owned the world. "Put your hands in the air," Clay ordered the paymaster. "Empty the box into my saddlebags. Now!" The paymaster, a trembling accountant in a wool suit, began to shove stacks of bills into the canvas bags Clay tossed to him.
The other two outlaws kept their rifles trained on the crowd, scanning for heroes. "No," Silas whispered. "Not after what we went through. Not after the storm." "Silas, don't," Elias hissed. "They'll kill you." Silas shifted his weight. He had a hammer tucked into his belt, the tool of his trade, the tool that had saved him. "I've lived my life by the swing of a hammer, Elias, but sometimes you have to fight fire with fire." Before Elias could stop him, Silas lunged. He didn't go for the gun. He went for Clay's horse. He swung the heavy sledgehammer with all his strength, crashing it into the cannon bone of the animal's front leg. The horse screamed, terrible sound, and collapsed sideways. Clay was thrown from the saddle, hitting the hard ground with a sickening crunch. "Kill him!" one of the other outlaws yelled. Time seemed to stretch. Elias saw the outlaw raising his rifle, aiming straight at Silas's head. Silas was dazed, struggling to disentangle his legs from the thrashing horse. Elias didn't think. He didn't weigh the morality or the legality. He just moved. He drew the .44 Remington. The handle was cold, slippery in the gloved hand. He didn't aim. He just pointed and pulled the trigger, recalling the rhythm of the spike driver. 1, 2, fire! The roar of the gun was deafening in the confined canyon, echoing like a cannon blast. The outlaw with the rifle spun around, the weapon flying from his hands as the bullet struck his shoulder. "Drop it!" Elias screamed, his voice cracking. He aimed the shaking gun at Clay, who was scrambling to his knees in the snow, his face twisted in fury. "You little rat," Clay hissed. He went for his hip. Boom! A second shot rang out, but it wasn't from Elias. Clay pitched forward into the slush, a red stain blooming on his back. Behind him, standing on the porch of the marshal's office, was the sleeping lawman. He held a smoking shotgun, his eyes now wide open and alert. "End of the line, Clay," the marshal said, his voice bored but loud. "Tie up the others, boys." The camp erupted into action. The workers, realizing the spell was broken, swarmed the remaining outlaws. There was no mercy in their eyes, only the release of weeks of pent-up frustration and fear. Silas stood up, shaking his head, dusting snow from his coat. He looked at the dead outlaw, then at Elias. Elias was standing frozen, the gun still pointed at the dead man, smoke curling from the barrel. "Elias!" Mary came running through the crowd, Clara in her arms. She had seen the shooting from the edge of the square. She stopped in front of Elias, her eyes wide with horror, not at the outlaw, but at the gun in her husband's hand. "Elias," she whispered. Elias looked down at his hand. He had fired a gun. He had tried to kill a man. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The mill worker, the gentle father who wept at the loss of his son, had taken a step into the darkness. He had chosen violence. "He was gonna shoot Silas," Elias said, his voice flat. "I had to." The marshal walked over, holstering his shotgun. He was a big man, bear of a man named Murphy. He looked at Elias, then at the dead outlaw. "Good aim," Murphy grunted. "You winged the other one. Save me the paperwork." Murphy reached out and took the gun from Elias's unresisting fingers. He checked the cylinder. "Next time, aim for the chest. It's a bigger target. And don't hold it like you're holding a dead rat. Hold it like you mean it." Murphy tucked the gun into his own belt. "I'll hold on to this until I'm sure you ain't gonna shoot yourself in the foot or shoot the wrong man." "He can keep it," Silas said, limping over. He looked at Elias with a mixture of pride and pity. "We didn't need the gun, brother. You found your own iron." That night, the camp felt different. The robbery had been thwarted, but the celebration was muted. The men sat in the saloons, drinking in silence, playing with the dice and the cards, but the energy was jagged. Elias sat by the wood stove in the shack, staring at the flames. He wasn't thinking about the money they had saved. He wasn't thinking about the warm coat Mary was sewing for Clara. He was thinking about the moment his finger tightened on the trigger. In Manchester, disputes were settled with words or unions or the quiet resentment of the lower classes. Here, disputes were settled with lead. It was fast, it was final, and it was terrifyingly democratic. The biggest brute could die from the smallest bullet. "Penny for your thoughts?" Mary said softly. She sat beside him, mending a tear in his shirt. "I almost killed a man, Mary," Elias whispered. "I wanted to kill him. For a second, when he pointed that rifle at Silas, I wanted him to die. I felt happy when the marshal shot him. What does that make me?" "It makes you a survivor," Mary said, pressing the needle through the cloth. "It makes you a father who protected your family. The world has teeth now, Elias. We grew teeth too. That doesn't make us monsters. It just means we don't get eaten." "The law," Elias said, the word tasting bitter. "The marshal slept through the whole thing until I fired." "The law is just men, Elias," Mary said. "Sometimes they sleep. Sometimes they're brave. You can't rely on the badge. You have to rely on the man next to you." She finished the stitching and bit the thread. She took his hand, the hand that had held the gun, and kissed the calloused palm. "This hand built a railroad," she said. "This hand held our son when he died. And today, this hand saved your brother. It is a good hand, Elias." Elias looked at his palm. He looked at Mary. The shadows of the past were still there, but now they were joined by the shadows of violence. He realized then that the West was not just a place where you struggled against nature. It was a place where you struggled against yourself. The next morning, the work resumed. The snow was melting, turning the camp into a slurry of mud and horse manure. The sounds of the hammers returned. Tang, tang, tang. Elias stood on the grade, holding the tongs. Silas was opposite, lifting the rail. The incident with Clay's gang was already old news, a ghost story to be told in the saloons that night. A rider approached the grading crew. It was Marshal Murphy. He reined in his horse near Elias and Silas. Murphy reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the .44 Remington. He tossed it to Elias. Elias caught it reflexively. "You got a steady hand for a mill worker, and you don't flinch. Keep it cleaned, keep it loaded. We're moving into Indian territory up ahead. The railroad."
Spring arrived in the high country not as a gentle thaw, but as a violent unraveling. The snowpacks that had buried the camp for months began to melt under the relentless April sun, swelling the rivers into raging brown torrents that tore at the foundations of the trestles. The mud was knee-deep, a sucking mire that trapped wagons and exhausted men before the workday even began. But the mud was not the only thing rising. Tension in the camp was taut as a violin string. The race was on. The newspapers from the east spoke of nothing but the contest between the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific. Who would reach the meeting point first? The government demanded speed, and the railroad bosses, men like the imperious General Dodge and the greedy Thomas Durant, passed that demand down the chain of command until it landed on the shoulders of men like Elias Thorne. Elias stood at the edge of the Dale Creek Canyon, staring down at the sheer drop. Below, the river looked like a silver ribbon. Between him and the other side stood a gap of death, 800 feet of empty air. A wooden trestle bridge was under construction, a spiderweb of pine timbers and iron bolts that looked too fragile to hold the weight of a man, let alone a locomotive. "They want the span finished by Friday," Silas said, walking up beside him. He held a clipboard, acting as a sub-foreman now. His face was drawn, his eyes shadowed by the brim of his hat. "Friday?" Elias laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "That's impossible. We haven't even poured the caissons for the main piers. The wind shear up here would knock a crane over." "The general says Friday," Silas said flatly. "He says if we don't make the grade, the Central Pacific wins. We don't get paid if we don't win. That's the new rule." "The new rule?" Elias turned to his face his brother. "Silas, we have a contract. We're paid by the mile. You can't just change the terms." "The railroad changes the terms whenever it wants," Silas snapped, his patience wearing thin. "You know that. We're just the muscle. We don't make the plans." Elias looked at the men working below on the scaffolding, tiny figures suspended over the abyss. "It's not right, Silas, driving them that hard. Someone's gonna die. The timber's green. It's not cured. It's soft." "If you don't like it, you can walk," a smooth voice cut in. Elias turned to see Mr. Vance, the construction superintendent. Vance was a man who wore a suit even in the mud, his shoes polished to a shine that seemed to mock the filth of the camp. He was flanked by 2 hired gunmen who lounged against the wagon, looking bored. "Gentlemen," Vance said, tipping his bowler hat, "Mr. Thorne, your crew tells me is lagging. Something about safety concerns?" "The wind is gusting at 40 knots, sir," Elias said, forcing himself to be respectful. "And the timber."
I don't pay you for meteorology, and I don't pay you for carpentry. I pay you to lay track. The railroad has invested heavily in this line. We need to beat the Mormons coming from the west. We need to secure the government bonds." "We are working as fast as we can," Elias insisted. "No," Vance said, stepping closer. His eyes were cold, dead things. "No, you are working as fast as you want to, which isn't fast enough. As of this morning, we are instituting a new incentive program. Speed bonuses for foremen who beat schedule, and deductions for crews who fall behind." "Deductions?" Elias stepped forward. "You mean you want to fine us for working in a hurricane?" "We call it efficiency adjustment," Vance smiled. "And if you don't like it, there are 1,000 Irishmen in Cheyenne who would kill for a shovel, Mr. Thorne. Don't think for a second that you are irreplaceable. You are a spoke in the wheel, and a spoke can be replaced." Vance turned and walked back toward his wagon, his guards snickering. Silas let out a long breath. "Don't, Elias, please, don't start anything. We need this money. Mary needs a real house before next winter. We have to buy more supplies." "And how do we buy supplies if he finds us for the wind?" Elias roared. "He's stealing from us, Silas. He's making us pay for the privilege of risking our lives." "Keep your voice down," Silas grabbed Elias's arm. "You think Vance is the only one? The whole system is built like this. If you fight, you lose. You get blacklisted. We starve. Just keep your head down. Do the work. Let me handle the talking." Elias pulled his arm away. He looked at his brother, the man who had dragged him out of the blizzard, the man who had saved his life. But now Silas looked like a stranger. He looked like a foreman. He looked like the enemy. "Handling the talking got us into the storm," Elias said quietly. "I'm not laying green timber over an 800-foot drop in a gale. Not for Vance, not for anyone." He walked away, leaving Silas alone at the edge of the canyon. That evening, the air in the mess hall was thick enough to cut with a knife. Elias sat with Pat and some of the other Irish workers, speaking in low tones. The efficiency adjustment had been posted on the bulletin board. Fines for broken tools, fines for delays, fines for insubordination. "It's slavery with a paycheck," Pat muttered, stabbing at his stew with a spoon. "It's theft," Elias said. His voice carried, though he didn't mean it to. "And if we accept it, we're cowards." Silas walked into the hall, his tray in his hand. The room went silent. He looked around, his eyes landing on Elias. Silas walked over to the table. "Eat your food, Elias. Get some sleep. We have an early start tomorrow." "We're not starting tomorrow," Elias said, standing up. The whole hall watched until Vance rescinds the fines. The silence turned into a vacuum. Silas's face hardened. He set his tray down on the table with a clatter. "Sit down," Silas growled. "No. These men are tired, Silas. They're scared. And now you're going to let the boss rob them? You're one of them now. You forgot where you came from." "I forgot?" Silas shouted, his control snapping. "I'm the one who kept you alive. I'm the one who got you this job. I'm the one who swallowed his pride and took orders from men like Vance so that you and Mary could have a future. You think you're a hero? You're just a stubborn mule who can't see the world for what it is." "I see the world just fine," Silas shot back. "I see men being ground into dust, and I see my brother standing on the other side of the whip." Silas stepped forward, his fist clenched. For a second, Elias thought his brother was going to hit him. "Don't you dare," Silas hissed, his face inches from Elias's. "Don't you dare question my loyalty. I'm doing this for us. If you strike, you're done. They'll fire us all. And then what? Where do we go? Back to England? Back to the mill?" "Better to die on my feet than live on my knees," Elias said, echoing a phrase he'd heard from one of the agitators. "Fine, then go," Silas spat. "But don't expect me to save you when the Pinkertons come with the batons." Silas grabbed his tray and walked out of the hall. He didn't look back. The alliance was fractured. The bond that had held the Thorne brothers together through the ocean, the wilderness, and the storm had snapped under the strain of the iron horse. The next morning, the sky was a bruised purple. The wind howled through the canyon, screaming like a banshee. The scaffolding on the bridge swayed visibly. Elias stood at the foot of the approach, flanked by Pat and 20 other Irishmen. They held their tools, but they did not climb the scaffolding. Vance rode out on his horse, the 2 guards beside him. He looked at the men standing idle, then at Silas, who stood apart from them, holding his hammer, his face a mask of misery. "Mr. Silas," Vance called out, "why are we not working?" Silas looked at Elias. He looked at the bridge. He looked at the floor. "They won't go up," Silas said quietly. "The wind is too high." "Irrelevant," Vance shrieked. "The deadline is Friday. Fire them, all of them." "I'll fire them myself, sir," Silas said. He walked over to Elias. The 2 brothers stood face to face, the wind whipping their clothes. "Go home, Elias," Silas broke. "Please, just take Mary and Clara and go. I'll talk to Vance. I'll try to fix it." "You can't fix it, Silas," Elias said, tears forming in his eyes. "You're part of it now." "Move," Silas screamed, pushing Elias. "Get out of the way." Elias stood his ground. "No." Suddenly, a crack like a cannon shot echoed through the canyon. High above them, on the unfinished section of the trestle, a support beam, green timber, warped by the sudden temperature drop and the relentless wind, snapped. The scaffolding, carrying a crew of 6 Chinese workers and 3 Irishmen, began to tilt. "Look out!" Pat roared. The scaffolding gave way with a groan of splintering wood. Men screamed as they fell, sliding down the slanted planks, grabbing desperately for ropes and beams. Silas didn't hesitate. He didn't think about the strike or the fines or the argument. He dropped his hammer and sprinted toward the anchor point of the scaffolding. The heavy ropes were sliding through the pulleys, burning the wood. "Hold the line!" Silas screamed. The weight of the falling men was dragging the entire structure off the cliff. If the anchor gave, the scaffolding would plummet into the gorge, taking the men with them. Elias moved. He wasn't thinking about his pride. He wasn't thinking about the fractured alliance. He saw his brother fighting the rope alone. He saw the men dying above. Elias ran. He threw himself on the rope next to Silas, wrapping it around his waist, digging his boots into the mud. "Pull!" Elias roared. Pat and the other men, Irish, Chinese, it didn't matter anymore, rushed forward. They grabbed the rope, adding their weight to the brothers. The rope sang with tension. The fibers.
May 1869. The Utah desert was a vast crucible of heat and dust that stretched to infinity. The air shimmered in waves, distorting the horizon so that the distant mountains looked like floating ghosts. The work had pushed the crews to the brink of human endurance. They were living on coffee, hardtack, and sheer will, driven by the relentless drumbeat of the race against the Central Pacific. They were within 10 miles of Promontory Summit, the meeting point, the place where 2 iron roads would stitch the continent together. Elias Thorne stood atop a ridge, looking down at the winding path of the tracks below. To the west, barely visible through the heat haze, he could see the dust cloud of the Chinese crews working for the Central Pacific. They were coming fast, laying up to 10 miles of track a day. "We're running out of time," Silas said, walking up to stand beside him. He wore a bandana around his neck to wipe the sweat and dust from his face. His skin was now the color of cured leather, tanned by 2 years of the high country sun. "They'll be here by tomorrow," Elias said. "If we don't clear that ridge by noon, they'll lay the last mile. The history books will say they won." "Does it matter who wins?" Silas asked. "Not to the iron," Elias said, "but to Vance it matters. He's desperate." As if on cue, the sound of shouting drifted up from the camp below. Elias and Silas looked down. The camp was in turmoil. Construction Superintendent Vance had returned, flanked not just by his usual guards, but by a posse of hired toughs from Ogden, men with badges bought and paid for by the railroad company. A wagon stood near the base of the ridge, loaded with crates of black powder, a dangerous amount of it. "Move it!" Vance was screaming, his face red, sweat dripping from his chin. "The Central Pacific is breathing down our necks. We need that ridge gone. Blast it now!"
The powder foreman, a veteran miner named O'Malley, stood his ground, shaking his head. "It's too hot, sir. The charge is too big for the heat. If we light it now, the shock wave will bring the whole cliff down on the grade below. We'll bury the track we just laid." "I don't care about the track," Vance roared. "I care about the hole, like the fuse." "We're not doing it," O'Malley said firmly. Vance drew his pistol. He didn't point it at O'Malley. He pointed it at the wagon. "I am the superintendent here. I represent the Union Pacific Railroad. I order this blast." He turned to his hired men. "If O'Malley won't light it, one of you do it." Elias looked at Silas. The same look passed between them that had passed during the storm. There was no calculation this time, no hesitation. "They're going to blow the ridge into the track," Silas said, his voice deadly calm. "If they do that, we'll have to relay 3 miles of track, and they'll blame us. We'll lose our wages." "We can't let them do it," Elias said. "No," Silas said, "we can't." They began to run. They scrambled down the steep slope, sliding on the loose gravel. Below them, one of the hired toughs, a man with a face full of scars, pulled a stick of dynamite and a lighter from his belt. He stepped toward the powder wagon. "Stop!" Elias screamed, his voice cracking. The tough paused, looking up. Vance turned, a sneer on his face. "Ah, the Thorne brothers, come to watch history?" Elias reached the bottom of the hill, gasping for air. He drew the .44 Remington from his holster, the gun Marshal Murphy had given him. He didn't raise it, but he held it at his side, the threat clear. "Step away from the wagon, Vance," Elias commanded. Vance laughed. "You? You're a laborer. You don't give orders, you take them. Boys, clear these trash out." 4 of the hired men stepped forward, reaching for their clubs and guns. "Pat!" Silas shouted. From behind the supply wagons, Pat, the Irishman, stepped out. He wasn't alone. Behind them stood the Chinese foreman, Mr. Lee, and behind them the entire crew. 30 men, 60 men, a wall of muscle, bone, and iron. They dropped their shovels. They picked up hammers, pry bars, and rocks. They didn't speak. They just stood there, shoulder to shoulder. "This is our line," Silas said, walking to stand next to Elias. He held the heavy sledgehammer in both hands. "We cleared the rock. We laid the grade. We're finishing this, and we're doing it right." Vance looked at the sea of faces. He saw the Chinese laborers, silent and stoic. He saw the Irish, angry and bruised. He saw the determination in Elias's eyes, the look of a man who had crossed an ocean and survived a blizzard. "This is mutiny," Vance hissed. "I'll have you all arrested. I'll see you hang." "There's no sheriff out here, Vance," Elias said, stepping closer, ignoring the guns pointed at him. "There's just us and the rock. If you kill us, who builds your railroad?" The standoff stretched out, tight as a wire. The tension vibrated in the hot air. The tough with the dynamite looked at Vance, then at the wall of men. He lowered the lighter. "I'm not getting my head bashed in for your bonus," the tough muttered, stepping back into the crowd. Vance's face turned a shade of purple. "Do it! I'm paying you!" "We're not getting paid enough to die," another one of the guards said, holstering his gun and walking away. The power structure crumbled in seconds. Without the thugs, Vance was just a man in a suit. He was weak. Elias walked up to him. He was inches away from the man who had threatened his family, stolen his wages, and endangered their lives. "Get back on your horse and get out of our camp," Elias said. Vance sputtered, his eyes bulging. You can't. The ceremony!" "The ceremony is for the men who built it, not the men who paid for it. Leave." Vance looked around for support. He found none. He climbed onto his wagon, his hands shaking with rage. He turned the horses around and whipped the reins, driving away in a cloud of dust. The camp erupted, not in violence, but in a roar of triumph. It was the sound of men who had finally stood up to the machine and won. "Now," Silas shouted over the noise, "O'Malley, do the drill right." The next 6 hours were a masterpiece of controlled chaos. Under the direct supervision of the crews, the powder was laid carefully. Tamping rods were used with precision. Charges were set to cut the rock precisely, not to blow it to pieces. When the blast finally came, it was not a chaotic explosion. It was a sharp, cracking report. The ridge didn't collapse into the grade. It disintegrated into neat, manageable rubble. "Clear the rock!" Silas shouted. The men descended on the pile like ants. Shovels flew. Baskets were filled. The track layers followed immediately behind them. They worked through the twilight and into the night. They didn't stop to eat. They were fueled by the victory and the looming presence of history. By dawn, the grade was level. By mid-morning, the rails were laid. They were there, Promontory Summit. To the west, the Union Pacific tracks met the tracks of the Central Pacific. There was a gap, just a few feet of empty prairie. And there, waiting, was the other crew. Chinese workers, Irishmen, men of all nations, standing on their side of the gap. They watched the Union Pacific crew approach. There were no guards, no bosses, just the workers. Silas walked forward. On the other side, a Chinese foreman walked out to meet him. They met in the center of the gap. Silas held out his hand. The foreman looked at it, then took it. They shook hands, a simple gesture that resonated louder than the cannon fire. "It is done," the foreman said in broken English. "Aye, it is done," Silas replied. The crews from both sides mingled. Language barriers vanished. They shared cigarettes, passed around flasks of whiskey. They laughed and slapped backs. They looked at each other's hands, calloused, scarred, broken, and saw mirrors of their own struggle. A train arrived from the west, the Jupiter. From the east came the number 11. They pulled up, their massive cow-catchers facing each other like duelists, separated by only the width of the final tie. The politicians arrived in carriages. The brass band played. Photographers set up their bulky cameras. Elias stood back, leaning against a water tower. He watched as a polished golden spike was brought out on a velvet pillow. "Look at them," Pap said, coming to stand next to him. "They're wearing silk. They're holding umbrellas against the sun." "Let them have the umbrellas," Elias said. "They can have the spike. They can have the speeches." "Is that it? Is it over?" Pat asked. Elias looked down at his hands. The blisters had turned to hard skin. The ache in his back had become a constant companion. "The railroad is done," Elias said. "The ocean is behind us. The mountains are behind us." "So what do we do now?" Pat asked. Elias looked up. To the north, vast open valleys stretched out, green and untouched by the steel. To the south, the red canyons beckoned. Mary and Clara were standing by the wagon, watching the ceremony. Elias saw Mary looking at him. She smiled, and it was a smile of peace. She wasn't thinking about Manchester anymore. She was thinking about tomorrow. "We live," Elias said. "We find our own horizon." The telegraph operator clicked out the message to the waiting world. Done. And as the 10 years had passed since the golden spike was driven into the ground at Promontory Summit, the ribbons of steel that Elias Thorne had helped lay with his own bleeding hands had multiplied, spreading across the continent like a web of veins, pumping blood and gold into the heart of the nation. The Wyoming landscape was no longer the terrifying, empty void it had once been. The hell-on-wheels towns had either been abandoned to the wind or had grown into respectable settlements of brick and stone. The wild buffalo herds had been thinned, replaced by vast herds of cattle that grazed on the lush grasses of the open range. Elias stood on the porch of a house that seemed impossible to him. It was a 2-story structure built of sawn lumber, with a proper shingled roof, glass windows that caught the morning sun, and a porch wide enough for a rocking chair. It sat on a homestead of 200 acres, a patch of earth carved out of the wilderness that belonged to him, signed in ink and sealed by the government. He was older now. His hair had turned the color of iron, and his face was a map of deep creases etched by the sun and the wind. His hands, resting on the railing, were scarred and twisted, the knuckles swollen with arthritis. The gun law days were behind him. The Remington lay in a trunk in the attic, oiled and wrapped in cloth, a relic of a darker time. "Papa?" Elias turned. Clara walked out of the house. She was 15 now, a young woman of the frontier. She wore a calico dress, but beneath it she walked with the stride of a rider. Her hair, the color of the dark earth of England, was braided loosely down her back. She didn't look like a mill girl. She looked like she belonged to the mountains. "It's time," she said softly. Elias nodded, picking up the bridle hanging by the door. "Is your mother ready?" "She's packing the basket. She made apple pies. I think she's trying to bribe Uncle Silas into fixing the well pump again." Elias smiled. It was a slow smile, but it reached his eyes these days. They walked to the barn. It wasn't just a shack. It was a solid structure housing 4 horses and a milk cow. Elias saddled his roan gelding, a beast named Trojan that he had traded for 3 years of back pay from the railroad. Clara swung onto her mare with an easy grace. They rode out at a walking pace, heading east. The land was green, the sky a piercing, impossible blue. They passed fields of wheat, neighbors' farms, and the occasional distant schoolhouse. Civilization had caught up to them. The silence of the plains was now filled with the sound of telegraph wires humming in the breeze and the distant whistle of trains. They arrived at Silas's homestead by mid-morning. Silas had done well, too. He had become a freight contractor, moving supplies between the railheads and the army forts. He was wealthier than Elias, his house bigger, but the fence was always white and the gate always open. Silas was outside chopping wood. He stopped when he heard the hoofbeats. He leaned on the axe, wiping sweat from his forehead. He was heavier now, gray like Elias, but his shoulders were still massive. The bear had turned into a bear of a man. "There he is," Silas grinned, wiping his hand on his trousers. "The gentleman farmer. Too good for honest sweat anymore, Elias?" "Just saving my energy for important things," Elias called back, swinging down from his horse. "Like what?" "Like beating you at checkers later." Mary came out of Silas's house, hugging her sister-in-law. The 2 women had become closer over the years, bound by the shared trauma of the early days. They talked about crops, the church, and the new school teacher, ignoring the ghosts that hovered on the fringes of the conversation. After lunch, the men sat on the porch, smoking pipes and watching the dust trail of the afternoon train moving in the distance. "The tracks are quiet today," Silas noted. "Probably carrying corn or cattle from Texas." "Remember when we thought the train was the loudest thing in the world?" Silas chuckled. "I can't sleep without the whistle now." "The world changed, Silas," Elias said thoughtfully. "When we first got here, we thought the railroad was the boss. We thought it was the future. Turns out, it was just the shovel. The real future is this." He gestured to the green fields, the houses, the fences. "It's the living." "Aye," Silas nodded. "And it's the dying, too." A shadow passed over Silas's face. "Pat passed last week, you know." Elias lowered his pipe. He hadn't heard. "Pat?" he asked. "He drank himself into a grave," Silas said sadly. "His liver gave out. He couldn't handle the quiet, I think. He was a fighter, Elias. He didn't know what to do when there was no one to fight." Elias looked over the valley. They had left many in the ground along the line. The boy whose leg was crushed, O'Malley, the powder foreman, who was buried in a cave-in near Promontory, the outlaws, the native warriors who fought for a way of life that was vanishing under the wheels of progress. The legacy of the frontier was not just the land, it was the cost. The ground beneath their boots was soaked in it. He made it this far, Elias said. That's more than most. Later that afternoon, Elias walked out to the small cemetery plot at the edge of Silas's property. He knelt before a simple wooden marker. It wasn't for Pat. It was a grave Silas had put there years ago. It was for their sister, Elsie. Silas had never spoken of her much, only that she had died on the journey west. Elias reached out and touched the rough wood. He thought of Samuel, buried in the cold soil of Manchester, and Elsie, buried in the hard soil of Wyoming. "We made it, little brother," he whispered to the grave. "We made it for all of you." As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the valley, Elias and Clara rode home. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the rustling of the grass and the distant call of a meadowlark. "Papa?" Clara asked, breaking the silence. He looked at her. She asked this occasionally, hungry for a past she had never known. "It was gray," Elias said. "The buildings were tall and crowded together. The sky was always gray with smoke. You couldn't see the horizon." "Did you hate it?" she asked. "I didn't know anything else," Elias said. "I thought that was how the whole world was. I thought life was just enduring, breathing in dust, breathing out worry." "And now?" asked Clara, looking around at the vast open sky. "Is life still enduring?" Elias thought about the question. He thought about the blizzard, the gunfights, the broken alliances, the sweat and the back-breaking labor. He thought about the fear of losing Mary, the fear of not being enough. "No," he said finally. "Now it's building. We aren't enduring anymore, Clara. We are making a life. Every fence post, every nail in the barn, every loaf of bread your mother bakes, we are making a life." "It sounds hard," she said. "It is," Elias agreed, "but it's ours. That's the difference. In Manchester, I belonged to the mill. Here, the land belongs to me, and I belong to it." They crested a small hill, and their home came into view. Smoke rose from the chimney, curling up into the purple twilight. Mary was on the porch, waving. Elias stopped the horse for a moment. He looked at the horizon one last time. The American dream, he realized, wasn't a pot of gold at the end of a rainbow. It wasn't a moment where the struggle stopped. It was the right to struggle for your own. It was the freedom to wake up in the morning and know that the sweat of your brow belonged to you and your family, not to a faceless corporation or a master in a high tower. He looked down the tracks that ran 2 miles away from their farm. A train was coming from the east, its headlight cutting through the gathering gloom. It roared past, carrying people, goods, dreams. He didn't hate the railroad anymore. He had helped build it. It was a scar, yes, but scars meant you had survived the wound. Elias patted the horse's neck. "Let's go home, Clara." They rode down the hill. Inside the house, the table was set. The fire was warm. The walls were sturdy, built of pine that Elias had felled himself. They sat together, Elias, Mary, and Clara. They held hands, the rough against the smooth, the old against the young. They bowed their heads. Elias didn't say a prayer from a book. He didn't ask for forgiveness or riches. "Thank you," he said simply, "for the work, for the strength, for the tomorrow." And outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the echo of the ocean, the blast of the dynamite, and the roar of the steam engine. But it was just the wind now. The ghosts were laid to rest. The iron horizon was no longer something to chase. It was something they had reached. And beyond it, there was only the infinite promise